Okay, so part two of chapter two, dealing with the foundation, the founding, and the Constitution, will deal directly with the governing of the new um, independent state of America. And so we'll talk about America's first national government, and then we'll go into the founding of our Constitution and what all that entailed into ratification. And so, America's first national government. Following independence, we obviously needed a government structure. We no longer could rely on the government structure offered underneath the British Crown. And so, in 1777, we're going to have the Second Continental Congress adopt what is known as the Articles of Confederation. And the Articles of Confederation will be in power from 1777 to 1789. The main goal of the Articles of Confederation is going to be limiting the power of the national government, or the central power. They had just broken away from a powerful monarchy, a powerful government that had the ability to encroach on individuals' life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. And so they didn't want to return to that. And so they wanted a very limited government. And so the structure of the Articles of Confederation was all about limiting the central government. Under the Articles of Confederation, there were no branches of government per se. All power was centralized in a legislative branch, in a Congress. There was no executive branch. States were to execute any laws that were passed by the central government, so there was no way to really enforce the laws. If a state didn't like the idea of a law or didn't want to enforce it, it simply didn't. There was little power in the members of Congress. Members of Congress were delegates who essentially answered to their representatives or their respective states. They weren't beholden really to the central government. They were really beholden to their states, and so they were to be chosen by state legislatures. They could be recalled by the states if necessary and immediately, and each state, regardless of size, had one vote. And Congress was given certain powers, right? They were given the power to declare war, to make peace, to make treaties, and to coin and borrow money. They were also given the ability to regulate trade with the native tribes, and they could appoint the senior officers of the U.S. Army. Now, there were significant deficiencies in the Articles of Confederation. There were significant things that they could not do. The central government could not levy taxes, so they didn't have a revenue source. They could not regulate commerce amongst the states. So while they could regulate trade with the natives, they could not regulate interstate commerce between the different states. They could not maintain an army, which is odd because in the powers that they do have, they could appoint the senior officers of the U.S. Army, but they could not maintain their own professional army. They had to rely on the state militias for the national army. Amending the Articles of Confederation required all 13 states to agree, which was nearly impossible. And it created a system where the states didn't work in unity. It actually is going to create an atmosphere where the states are going to be pitted against one another for certain reasons, for economic reasons, for political reasons. And so there is really no political unity in the Articles of Confederation. The relationship between the central government and the states was that of more like an international organization. In a confederation, all states maintained their own powers and responsibilities. In a confederation, power flows from the bottom to the top instead of the top to the bottom. And the central government was extremely reliant upon the states. But if the states didn't like what was being requested of them by the national government, the states were extremely unresponsive to the central government. And so the idea of federalism, which will become very clear to you in the next chapter in the next few lectures, the idea of federalism wasn't a thing. And federalism is the sharing of powers between the state and the national or central government. There was not federalism. There was not the ability for the federal government to essentially have and delegate power. All of the power was in the bottom, in the different states, and in a confederation, it's this loose conglomeration of states that give power to a central government. And there were shifting political powers. Those radicals within society that had actually been kept in check for so long, they're going to emerge from this time period better organized, more controlling than before, and the elite is going to be significantly weakened. And then there's going to be significant confusion that will ensue as to who is in charge, what powers the central government had, etc. John Adams is going to be sent to England to negotiate a treaty. And when he gets to England, they say, we cannot negotiate a treaty with a government that has no head, because remember, there was no president. And so he was told that the English government would actually negotiate directly with each of the 13 colonies. And so you're going to have a situation where there is no unity, and each of the different colonies are going to negotiate a peace treaty with Great Britain, and they're going to vary by state, depending on the needs and wants of that state. And so one state could perhaps supersede another, and there's not going to be any conformity across all of the colonies or all of the states. And so there's going to be significant change that is needed in America, but it's very hard to change the Articles of Confederation, because remember, you have to have 13 out of 13 states agree. There has to be unanimous agreement to change. And so enter the Annapolis Convention. In 1786, Virginia, the state of Virginia, will invite states to a convention in Annapolis, Maryland, to explore the idea of changing the Articles of Confederation. Individuals in Virginia and in Maryland realized that there needed to be some kind of interstate commerce regulation by the federal government. It was in the best interest of all of the colonies. And so they're asking that all of the states come together at this convention in 1786 to try to make changes to this Article of Confederation to help with the betterment of the new nation. But only 5 states are going to send delegates, because they don't have to come if they don't want to. And so they can't really do much, because they need a unanimous 13 out of 13 in order to change the Articles of Confederation. But what they do is they put into motion events that will lead to what is known as the Second Founding and the creation of a new document. And so at the Annapolis Convention, the delegates will send out a resolution calling for commissioners to meet in Philadelphia, giving the impression that they would discuss improving the Articles of Confederation. Now, when they meet in Philadelphia, obviously they're going to realize that they cannot really fix the Articles of Confederation, so a new document will be born out of that convention. But there were some positives. As weak and ineffective as the Articles of Confederation were, there were some positives. It enacted the Land Ordinance of 1787, which established the principles of land surveying and ownership, and this will govern westward expansion. It will also outline the idea of the Northwest Ordinance, in which states agreed to surrender claims on Western land, which will then open the way for new states to join the Union and for the Union to grow. And so there were some positives, but out of the Articles of Confederation, there were significant drawbacks, significant negatives. And then we have an event called Shays' Rebellion. And Shays' Rebellion was led by a Massachusetts farmer named Daniel Shay. He was a former Army captain that had fought in the American Revolution. Um, and he was leading a group of farmers in rebellion against the Massachusetts government. The government had agreed that if individuals came and fought in the revolution, then they wouldn't be required to um, pay back taxes on their land while they were serving. But then after the revolution, the government had levied high taxes against them, and this ended up in many of the farms being foreclosed on. And so these farmers are going to riot. And the state militia um, is going to have to step in to put down this riot. In fact, states look to the national government when this riot occurs because this riot got really pretty big. And Massachusetts is going to look to the national government to put down this riot, this rebellion. And the national government's like, you didn't give me the power to create an army. We don't have an army. We don't have money to raise an army. There's nothing we can do about this. And so the Massachusetts militia will have to come together along with privately funded militias by the elite people in Massachusetts, and they will have to put down this mob. And this is going to demonstrate the deficiencies of the national government, and the Constitutional Convention might not have happened if not for the terror associated with this rebellion. So it's really going to point to the fact that the national government's hands are tied when it comes to providing safety and security to the different states. And so we're going to have a constitutional convention. And the delegates are going to meet in Philadelphia in May of 1787. And it is important to understand that the convention's main goal was not originally to throw out the Articles of Confederation. When the delegates met, they faced so much strife within themselves that it became clear that the Articles of Confederation was insufficient to remedy any of these problems. Excuse me. And so it's going to become clear that a new document is needed. And so debate is going to ensue regarding what this document is going to look like. Now, we have a whole lot of different interests within the Constitutional Convention that are vying for power in this new document. You have the big states versus small states, the more populous versus the less populous states. You have the the northern states versus the southern states. You got a bunch of different cleavages in society here. And so we're going to see a number of different things that will emerge along these political lines. And the first thing that we see as they are trying to develop a new government is the emergence of what is known as the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan is going to be proposed by Edmund Randolph with influences from James Madison. Randolph proposes a resolution to change the Articles of Confederation. It was actually such a monumental resolution that it essentially created an entirely new government. And so the plan created a national legislature with a system of representation based upon population of states. Okay? So you're going to, essentially what is going to happen is we will have a bicameral legislature, meaning two chambers. The national legislature will, in the lower house, will be based upon population of the states. So the more people you have, the more representation you have in that lower house. It proposed an upper house filled with individuals selected by the lower members. Right? And so if your state has more representation in the lower house, it's going to fill the upper house with more people from these larger states, and it's going to be heavily biased in favor of large states. And so there will be some significant opposition by these smaller states. And so what emerges is a new plan called the New Jersey Plan, proposed by William Paterson of New Jersey. And because of this heavily biased Virginia plan, the smaller states say, here's our plan. This plan calls for equal representation of each state in the national legislature, regardless of population. They figured that this would be more fair, so that the entire nation wasn't dominated by the more populous states, because these populous states didn't necessarily have the same needs and wants as these less populous states. And so things got really ugly. Factions are going to form, maneuvering will occur, manipulation will occur, tempers are going to flare. Large states gave the small states an ultimatum that they would just go along with that they should just go along with Virginia plan or wreck the Union. Small states told large states that they'd do it, and they'd find better and more honest allies in Europe if they wrecked the Union. And so we've got a lot of ultimatums being flung back and forth by these large states, by these small states. And so what do? Well, we have to compromise. And so what emerges is the Connecticut, or the Great Compromise, proposed by Roger Sherman of Connecticut. And the debate will culminate with this Great Compromise to create a bicameral legislature. So we're going to have a two-chambered legislature. The lower house, which is the House of Representatives, will be decided based upon the population of each state. The upper house, the Senate, will be based upon equal representation regardless of size. Now, you would think that this would appease both the large states and the small states, but it didn't. And tempers flared again. It caused some of the small state delegates to storm out of the convention. And before all the dust settles, it becomes apparent that we have to either go with this Connecticut Compromise or dissolve the Union. And so ultimately it will be accepted because the alternative is to fail as a nation. And guys, all of the world's eyes are on this new nation, right? This is the first time that we really see a colony successfully break away from their mother country. And so there's going to be some very high stakes in play here. And so the Connecticut Compromise, now, it's really too oversimplification to say it solves the problem, because it didn't really solve the problem, but it's better than the alternative. But it brings about another question, the question of slavery. Now that representation was, quote, solved, the argument of whether or not to count slaves as part of a state's population came to the forefront of the delegates' debate. James Madison observed that the real debate was not really between big states and small states, but between northern states and southern states. So as far back as 1787, the inception of our nation, we're having this debate between northern and southern states regarding slavery. It is not something that just popped up in the 1860s that we dealt with in isolation. Nothing in history happens in isolation. If we look back, the roots of the slavery question are going to be in the founding of our nation. And so the question of slavery comes up. Tempers are again going to flare. North Carolina suggests that they would not join the Union if slavery was outlawed, and that the slaves should be counted as representation. So on the one hand, slaveholding states are saying they're property, but if it's going to benefit us, we want them counted as part of our numbers, our population, for representation. And so North Carolina is going to say, hey, we just won't join if y'all outlaw slavery. And so we want slaves to be counted as representation. Counting slaves would give a huge advantage to the slaveholding states, because slaves outnumbered free whites in some of these places as much as 10-1. And so it would enable slaveholding states to have a larger apportionment of seats in the House of Representatives. Pennsylvania suggested if slaves were counted, that they should be treated like ordinary citizens instead of property, right? If you're counting them as people, they should be treated like people, meaning maybe we shouldn't have slavery. If they were property, they shouldn't be. They should be treated like property. And one delegate is saying, if we count, if you think they're property and we count them as property in um, the count for population, then we should count other pieces of property as well, right? Towards apportionment. So it just doesn't make sense. So again, we're at an impasse. And again, what do we have to do? We have to compromise. And so the three-fifths compromise is going to be proposed by an individual named James Wilson of Pennsylvania. Northerners and Southerners will eventually reach an agreement with the three-fifths compromise. House seats will be apportioned according to the population, where three-fifths of the slave population was counted. So slaves who were obviously not allowed to vote were counted in the number of representatives that would be apportioned to the slaveholding states. And so Northerners are also going to agree to allow the slave trade to continue for another 20 years. But in 1808, the slave trade will be outlawed in America. Now, this does not mean slavery is outlawed, because we know slavery doesn't end until officially after the Civil War. But in 1808, for another 20 years after the Three-Fifths Compromise, in 1808, we cannot import more slaves. You can keep the ones you already have, but you cannot import more. Okay? Now, understand that no one was really satisfied, but it kept the South in the Union for now. It didn't solve any problems. It actually only kicked the can down the road. And this will be something that the nation will have to deal with in the 1860s, when the powder keg finally will blow and the nation will erupt into the Civil War. So actions taken during the Constitutional Convention sort of put a Band-Aid over this debate until, another 80 years later, right? And so we have the formulation of some type of a document that will govern our nation. It will provide for an executive branch. It will provide for a judicial branch. There will be three branches of government, a la Montesquieu. In the legislature, we will have a bicameral legislature with a House of Representatives based upon population and a Senate. Every state will have 2 senators regardless of size. And so we have really the formulations of a new government that will take place. And so eventually the factions are going to get things worked out. They get things worked out enough to send to the states this document for ratification. Now, there are provisions in the Constitution that talk about ratification. And they make it a little bit easier for this to be ratified than the Articles of Confederation, because under the Articles of Confederation, all 13 states had to agree. Now, only 9 of 13 states had to ratify. But ratification does become a hurdle. Ratification is going to be done via state conventions of delegates elected by the people of each state, right? So we have 13 states, and thus 13 state separate campaigns urging for and against ratification. So there is a lot of propaganda out there regarding the Constitution. Those in favor of it, those against it. Lots of different campaigns, propaganda, pamphlets, articles, newspapers, people speaking, circulating information about the Constitution and why it is wonderful and why it is terrible, and trying to work for ratification or trying to work against ratification. And so we start to see the first political parties really emerge as a result of this ratification debate. And the first group that we'll talk about are the Federalists. The Federalists are going to be the faction that support the Constitution, and they are extremely united in their support. They prefer a strong national government. There are going to be individuals, very significant individuals like Alexander Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison, who write a series of papers in support of the Constitution. These become collectively known as the Federalist Papers. They all contributed to the papers, writing in favor of the government under the name Publius. They defended the Constitution, and they tried to dispel fears of the Constitution. Typically, there is going to be a significant divide in regards to who supports the Federalists and who supports the Anti-Federalists. Federalists were typically supported by the higher class, upper level people within society, and Anti-Federalists were typically the everyday individuals. And so the Anti-Federalists, they sort of create these group of writings called the Anti-Federalist Papers. They're not supportive of the Constitution, but they are extremely divided amongst themselves in regards to what the alternative should be. So even though they are united in their disapproval of the Constitution, they are divided in regards to why. And so, excuse me. They defended the idea of small state governments. They preferred a decentralized federal government. Individuals in the Anti-Federalist camp, the supporters who supported anti-federalism, were Patrick Henry, Samuel Adams, George Mason, James Monroe, Richard Henry Lee. And they will write some documents, some papers in newspapers, some articles in newspapers as the Federal Farmer and as Brutus, extolling why they are against the Constitution. They are more in favor of a loose confederacy with a weak national government, similar to what was had under the Articles of Confederation. Now, there's going to be three areas of different disagreement. Okay? The three areas of disagreement are going to be representation, tyranny of the majority, and government power. The first area of disagreement under representation, Anti-Federalists argued in favor of a localized government to represent the people. They felt that a national government wouldn't be homogeneous enough to represent individuals. They felt like the farther removed from the people the government was, the more out of touch they would become, and that the nation was too large to be able to have a national legislature effectively represent the people. They felt like people at the local level could really represent the people better than somebody far removed in a national capital. The Federalists argued in favor of the national government. They saw the removal of representatives from the people as a good thing. They had to balance the wants of citizens with what was good as a nation, and so distance would allow them to have some, quote, breathing room to consider all angles. The second area of disagreement is the tyranny of the majority. Now, both feared tyranny, but the Anti-Federalists feared tyranny of the aristocracy. And remember, Federalists were typically members of that aristocracy. They said all governments tended to lean aristocratic, with few people amassing power and utilizing it in ways not beneficial to all. They wanted more citizen oversight. They didn't like the idea of electoral college, which was outlined in the new Constitution as a method to elect the president. They didn't like senator selections by state legislatures, which was the way that we selected senators up until the 1920s. And they hated the idea of an appointed judge, which is all federal judges are appointed by the president. Federalists, on the other hand, feared the tyranny of the majority. They feared the united majority would trample the rights of the minority. And they felt that the areas of the Constitution that the Anti-Federalists feared the most would actually balance the power and help to avoid tyranny. The third area of disagreement is going to be in government power. Now, Both liked the idea of limited government, but their approach was different. Anti-Federalists wanted the powers of the government to be carefully and specifically spelled out and limited. They were afraid that the federal government would swallow up the state governments. They hated one specific clause in the Constitution known as the Supremacy Clause, as well as the Necessary and Proper Clause, which we'll talk about more in depth as we get to talking about Congress. They hated both of these clauses. They wanted a Bill of Rights added to specifically limit the government and to protect citizens' liberties. The Federalists liked a more broad approach to government powers. They argued that the federal government needed broad powers to defend the nation, as well as guard domestically, promote commerce, and expand the economy. They agreed that this power could be abused, but said that internal checks and balances set up in the Constitution would guard against this abuse. Also, the division of power between the federal and state governments would actually protect citizens because liberties would actually protect citizens' liberties because when one government overstepped their bounds, they could appeal to the other government to check the abuser. So kind of like a kid playing a parent against one another. Dad did this, so I'm going to go to mom. The state did this, so I'm going to go to the federal government. Or the federal government did this, so I'm going to appeal to the state government. And they felt that the Bill of Rights would be unnecessary because the entire document, they felt, was essentially a Bill of Rights. But they would eventually embrace the spirit of a Bill of Rights for ratification of the Constitution. So we've got significant differences that have played out. There's a battle for the soul of this Constitution between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists because they just philosophically disagree as to what the government should look like. Now, ratification will take place. The Constitution will be ratified. Delaware will become the first. Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Georgia, all very quickly in rapid succession, with Connecticut and Massachusetts and Maryland, South Carolina, New Hampshire, and then Virginia. Right? New York kind of holds out a little bit. North Carolina sort of holds out. Rhode Island holds out a little bit. They're going to be the last to ratify the Constitution in 1790, which is quite a ways after the ratification begins in 1787. But Rhode Island's always sort of been their own character, marched to the beat of their own drum. Sometimes even referred to by some as Rogues Island because they sort of go rogue on occasion. But the Constitution will be ratified. And so we will see this ratification debate take place over the course of 1787 to 1790, and the Constitution will eventually go into effect. It will become the law of the land, and it will create some things that are very significant, one of those things being federalism, which we will explore in our next lecture. So we'll stop here, and I'll see you then.